In the heart of the quiet forest, Susan's compassion led her to help an elderly woman, unaware that her simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change her life forever. From the peaceful serenity of the woods to the heavy weight of betrayal, secrets, and the threat of danger, Susan navigates a whirlwind of emotions and challenges. With her son's safety at stake and a deceitful web of lies closing in, Susan's courage shines through as she faces a dangerous game that tests her strength and determination. And yet, amidst the chaos, she finds hope, a brighter future for her and her son, and the promise of a better tomorrow. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. In the quiet solitude of the forest, a young mother named Susan stumbled upon an elderly woman, frail and alone, who seemed lost among the towering trees. Compassion surged through Susan's heart as she approached the woman, offering her the warmth of her presence and the comfort of her company. With gentle care, Susan led the elderly woman to safety, guiding her through the dense forest as the wind whispered through the leaves, their footsteps echoing on the forest floor. It was a moment of kindness, born from the depths of Susan's soul, and she thought little of it, her only focus on helping someone in need. Not long after, the elderly woman, with gratitude shining in her eyes, handed Susan a peculiar package. The package was old and weathered, wrapped in faded cloth that held the weight of time and secrets untold. Susan accepted it with a polite smile, not expecting much from the mysterious gesture. But as soon as she returned home and carefully unwrapped the cloth, her breath caught in her throat. What she found inside left her utterly speechless, her heart racing with disbelief and awe. The contents of the package were beyond anything she could have imagined, and in that moment, she realized that the simple act of kindness she had extended in the forest had set in motion something extraordinary, something that would change her life forever. As Susan cradled her young son David in the car seat, she couldn't help but gaze at his peaceful, innocent face. His tiny hands curled into soft fists as he slept soundly, oblivious to the struggles weighing on his mother's mind. "Come on, my sweet boy. It's time for daycare. Mommy has to go to work," she whispered lovingly, brushing a tender kiss against his forehead. David stirred slightly, offering a sleepy smile that tugged at Susan's heartstrings. As she drove, her mind raced with anxious thoughts. Daycare costs were becoming harder to manage with each passing month, and the bills seemed to multiply no matter how much she worked. How am I going to keep up? I need a miracle. Anything to make this easier, she thought, her eyes flickering between the road and the rearview mirror, where her son lay blissfully unaware of the storm of worries brewing in his mother's mind. When they arrived at the daycare, Susan carefully lifted David from his car seat, trying her best not to disturb his peaceful slumber. She held him close for a moment longer, feeling the soft rise and fall of his little chest against hers. "You'll be just fine here, sweetheart. I promise I'll be back as soon as I can," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she pressed another gentle kiss to his forehead. Handing him over to the kind caregiver, Susan felt a pang in her heart as she walked away. She glanced back to see David waving his tiny hand at her, a gesture so innocent yet so powerful that it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "I'm doing this for you, my darling. Every sacrifice, every struggle, it's all for you," she murmured to herself, pushing back the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Arriving at work, Susan steeled herself for another long day as the ever-efficient secretary to Thomas, the demanding yet fair CEO of the company. Her desk, as always, was impeccably organized, a reflection of her dedication to her job and her unwavering determination to provide for David. When Thomas approached, the weight of responsibility seemed to settle even heavier on her shoulders. His presence was commanding, yet there was an unspoken respect between them, a recognition of Susan's relentless effort and reliability. "Good morning, Susan. I need you to review the presentation for today's meeting and make sure my 11 with Mr. Alvarez is confirmed," he instructed, his tone carrying both authority and trust. Susan nodded with a quiet smile, her voice steady and reassuring. "Absolutely, Thomas. I'll take care of everything. It will all be ready on time," she promised, her words filled with more than just professionalism. They were laced with a determination born from necessity. As Thomas walked away, Susan allowed herself a brief moment of introspection. "He believes in my abilities. I can't afford to let him down," she thought, pushing away the creeping doubts that tried to invade her mind. The morning unfolded in a whirlwind of tasks: phone calls, emails, preparations for the important meeting, each one handled with precision and care. But even as she moved through the motions of her work, her thoughts kept drifting back to David, to the mounting bills waiting for her at home. Maybe it's time to ask for a raise, she considered, but the thought immediately brought a wave of anxiety crashing over her. What if he doesn't think I'm worth it? What if he won't? What if it jeopardizes everything I've worked so hard to maintain? The fear of the unknown twisted inside her, making it difficult to breathe. Yet she pushed through, knowing that every moment of struggle was a step closer to securing a better future for her son. When the time for the meeting finally arrived, Susan stood confidently, knowing everything was meticulously prepared. She had reviewed the presentation until she knew it inside and out, and the conference room was set, with every detail in place. As Thomas walked past her, he gave her a brief, approving nod, a small but significant gesture that sent a wave of pride surging through her. That single look felt like a validation of her hard work and dedication. "I am capable," she quietly reminded herself, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "For David, I can tackle any challenge that comes my way." As the day drew to a close, Susan gathered her belongings, mentally preparing herself for the transition from the professional world back to her role as David's mother. The balance between these two parts of her life wasn't always easy to maintain, but today she allowed herself a moment to celebrate the small victories. One step at a time, she whispered to herself as she stored away the final documents and flicked off the office lights. The darkness of the office seemed almost peaceful, a contrast to the constant hustle of her day. "For you, David," she thought, "I do all of this and so much more." With this resolve, she shut the office door behind her, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring for her and her precious son. Evening crept in, painting the city in shades of twilight. Across town, in a neighborhood defined by towering high-rises and sprawling mansions, a very different scene unfolded. Thomas's life with his wife Sophia was one of luxury and elegance, a sharp contrast to Susan's daily grind. As Thomas adjusted his tie in the mirror, preparing for their dinner plans, he glanced at Sophia, who was lounging gracefully on the velvet sofa. His expression was careful, almost hesitant, as he spoke. "Sophia, my mother called earlier today. She mentioned she's coming over for dinner tonight," he said, watching closely for her reaction. Sophia's relaxed demeanor shifted ever so slightly at the mention of Thomas's mother, Karen. Though she tried to keep her voice even, a trace of tension slipped through. "Karen is coming tonight," she repeated, attempting to mask her discomfort with a polite smile. "Well, darling, that's nice. I just wish she had given us a little more notice." That's all. Her words were measured, but Thomas could sense the subtle displeasure beneath the surface. He nodded in understanding. "I know," he replied softly, trying to smooth over the situation. "She said she has something special to celebrate but didn't give me any details. You know how she is, always full of surprises." His attempt at lightening the mood was met with a slight nod from Sophia, though her unease lingered. Thomas reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "But that's part of her charm, isn't it? The unpredictability. And I know deep down you appreciate that about her." Sophia let out a small sigh, more resigned than relieved, and took a sip of her wine. "Yes, darling, you're right. It's just sometimes it's hard to keep up with her surprises." As the evening progressed, the tension between them softened, helped along by the warm glow of candlelight and the flow of rich red wine. Despite the unexpected guest, Thomas and Sophia managed to find a rhythm, their shared understanding and love easing the edges of the evening. Not long after, Karen arrived at their doorstep, her ever-present camera slung around her neck and a bottle of wine cradled in her arm like an offering. Sophia greeted her with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, her usual composure slipping just a bit as she welcomed her mother-in-law. Thomas, eager to smooth the evening, stepped forward to help Karen settle in, guiding her to the comfortable chair in their well-decorated living room. The evening unfolded in polite conversation, small talk about Karen's recent photographic endeavors, travels, and trivial matters that kept the conversation flowing without delving too deep. As the conversation meandered, Thomas's gaze drifted to the camera hanging from Karen's neck, a familiar sight that always seemed to accompany her. Curiosity got the better of him. "Mom." He began with a playful tone, "You always have that camera with you. Are you expecting to capture a special moment tonight?" There was a hint of both jest and genuine interest in his voice. Karen's eyes sparkled with that characteristic twinkle, one that hinted at something more than just a passing comment. "Oh, Thomas," she responded with a knowing smile, "you never know when a special moment might present itself. Like right now, for instance." With that, she rose from her seat, positioning herself to capture a spontaneous shot of Thomas and Sophia sitting together. The camera clicked, freezing the moment in time, and the quiet whirring sound of the instant photo being printed filled the room. With a dramatic flourish, Karen handed the freshly printed photo to Sophia. "Here, darling," she said warmly, though her tone held layers of unspoken meaning. "Keep this in your wallet as a reminder of good times." Her smile was wide, but beneath it, there was an air of something unspoken, something that only Sophia could sense. Sophia accepted the photo, forcing a smile in return. "Thank you, Karen. How thoughtful of you," she said, her words carefully chosen to avoid any hint of the underlying tension she felt. She slipped the photo into her wallet, the act mechanical, as her mind spun with questions. Why this photo? What does she really mean by this, she wondered silently. To anyone else, the gesture might have seemed innocent, even kind, but to Sophia it was a reminder of the unspoken rivalry that simmered between them, a rivalry masked by polite exchanges and surface-level smiles. Thomas observed the interaction, a familiar pang of unease settling in his chest. He loved both women dearly, his mother, Karen, with her larger-than-life personality, and his wife, Sophia, with her grace and quiet strength. Yet, he was all too aware of the delicate balance between them, a balance that always felt as though it could tip at any moment. Maybe one day things will be different, he thought wistfully, though the thought didn't bring him much comfort. He knew that the harmony between the two most important women in his life was fragile at best, and he often felt caught in the middle, unsure of how to bridge the divide. The rest of the evening played out in a similar fashion, light conversation interspersed with moments of laughter, yet underneath the surface, there were currents of tension, unspoken words, and unresolved feelings. The photo, now tucked away in Sophia's wallet, was more than just a snapshot. It was a symbol of the complicated dynamic within their family. What Karen saw as a simple act of capturing a memory felt to Sophia like a subtle reminder of the complexity of their relationship, a rivalry that was carefully veiled behind Karen's seemingly innocent gestures. As dinner drew to a close, Karen looked at both Thomas and Sophia with a shrewd, almost knowing expression. "I hope you two are taking care of each other," she said, her voice carrying a weight that went beyond the casual tone of her words. "Family is the most precious thing we have." There was a lingering meaning in her statement, a message meant as much for Sophia as it was for Thomas. Sophia, feeling the pressure of Karen's words, responded with measured caution. "Of course, Karen," she said, her voice steady yet guarded. "We understand that, and we're always grateful for your reminders about what's important." She forced another smile, this one feeling more like a mask than a genuine expression, but it was all she could muster in that moment. Sensing the growing tension, Thomas quickly stepped in, eager to lighten the mood and bring some levity back to the conversation. "Mom, he said with a warm smile. Sophia's right. We're a strong family, and that's thanks to both of you. I couldn't ask for a better wife, and soon we'll be even stronger because, as I mentioned, we're planning to have a baby. He looked at both women, hoping that this announcement would act as a bridge, bringing them closer together in anticipation of the future. Karen's expression softened, and for a moment the tension seemed to dissipate. That's wonderful news, she said, her voice filled with genuine happiness. Sophia, too, felt a flicker of hope, but deep down, she knew that the complexity of their relationship wasn't something that could be easily solved, even with the promise of a new addition to the family. Still, for that evening, they allowed themselves to focus on the joy of the moment, setting aside the underlying tensions, if only for a little while. Karen stood gracefully, her camera hanging from her neck like a trusted companion, ready to leave for the night. With a final glance at Sophia, she offered parting words that lingered in the air. I only want the best for both of you. Remember, special moments aren't just meant to be captured in photos, they should be held close in your hearts. Her eyes rested on Sophia a moment longer, as if trying to convey something deeper. She then gave Thomas a warm kiss on the cheek and waved politely to Sophia before heading out the door. As the sound of the door closing echoed through the house, the tension that had filled the room seemed to evaporate with Karen's departure. Yet, it left behind an unsettling quiet, an emptiness that neither Sophia nor Thomas could ignore. The two of them moved about the kitchen, clearing dishes and putting things away, their actions mechanical, their words few. But the silence between them spoke volumes. Each glance exchanged revealed the insecurities they were both grappling with, the tiny cracks in their relationship that neither dared to acknowledge out loud. It was as if the evening's unease had exposed the fragility of their connection, yet they continued their tasks, avoiding the conversation they both knew they needed to have. Meanwhile, across the city, in a modest apartment filled with quiet whispers of a simpler life, Susan sat alone at her small kitchen table. The hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city were the only interruptions to the silence of her home. David was fast asleep, his soft breaths the rhythm of peace that Susan clung to at the end of every long day. But tonight her mind was far from restful. She stared at the stack of bills on the table, each envelope a reminder of the mounting pressure that threatened to overwhelm her. Working for Thomas had been a lifeline. His generous pay and understanding nature were the only things keeping her afloat. Yet, despite his kindness and her gratitude, it never seemed to be enough. Each month, the bills piled up faster than she could keep up, and the financial strain weighed heavily on her. I need a raise, she thought, the words repeating in her mind like an urgent plea. But how could she ask for more when Thomas had already done so much for her? He had been more than just a boss. He had supported her with flexible hours to accommodate David's daycare and had always treated her with respect, something Susan knew not every employer would offer. Am I being ungrateful, she wondered, guilt gnawing at her as she wrestled with the decision. She replayed moments from the office in her mind, the quick, friendly exchanges with Thomas, the way he trusted her with important tasks, the genuine smiles they shared amid the chaos of their busy days. He's a good man, she reminded herself. Maybe he'll understand. Clinging to that hope, Susan knew she couldn't wait any longer. Tomorrow, she resolved, her heart filled with a mix of determination and fear. I'll talk to Thomas. I have to do this for David's sake. The resolve strengthened her, and she began to craft a plan in her mind, carefully considering how she would express her gratitude, explain her situation, and make her request without coming across as unappreciative or demanding. That night, Susan barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of the conversation she would have with Thomas. Morning came all too soon, and the sound of the alarm jolted her awake. She moved through her morning routine with quiet efficiency, dressing David and taking him to daycare, all while her thoughts remained fixated on the task ahead. Each step of the morning felt like a prelude to something bigger, and as she dropped David off, Her heart felt heavier with the weight of what she needed to do. Arriving at the office, Susan immediately set to work, organizing her desk with the meticulous care she always brought to her job. Papers aligned, pens in place, everything ready except her nerves. She tried to steady herself, mentally rehearsing how she would approach Thomas. It wasn't long before he arrived, and as soon as she saw him, she noticed something different. His usually confident demeanor seemed overshadowed by a subtle weariness, the kind that hinted at sleepless nights and personal troubles. "Good morning," Susan Thomas greeted her, his voice carrying its usual warmth, but with a touch of something heavier, something that made Susan pause. She returned the greeting with a smile, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was weighing on him. To her surprise, Thomas didn't head straight to his office like he usually did. Instead, he walked over to her desk and, in an unusual gesture, sat down across from her. It was as though he needed someone to talk to, someone who could listen without judgment. "You know, Susan," he began, his voice softer than usual, "last night's dinner was." Let's just say it was tense. He hesitated, as if unsure of how much to share, but then he continued. "My mother, Karen, decided to come over for dinner unannounced. You know how she is full of surprises. But it didn't go well. Sophia and my mother, they just don't get along. And I feel like I'm stuck in the middle of it all." His eyes searched Susan's face, looking for some kind of reassurance, some sense of understanding. He had always been the composed, confident leader at work, but here, in this moment, he seemed vulnerable, as though the weight of his personal life was finally catching up to him. Susan listened intently, her own worries momentarily set aside as she saw the human side of Thomas, the man behind the title, struggling with the same complexities of life that she faced in her own way. For a moment, the power dynamic between them faded, and they were just two people navigating the difficulties of life, trying to make sense of it all. Susan, taken aback by Thomas's rare openness, listened with a deep sense of empathy, offering him a safe harbor to express the turmoil he was facing. "That must be incredibly hard for you," she said softly, her voice full of compassion. "They're the two women you love most in the world, and being caught between them can't be easy." Thomas sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if the weight of his burden had become too heavy to carry alone. "It's complicated," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "My mother. She has her doubts about Sophia. She thinks Sophia is with me for reasons other than love, maybe out of convenience. Maybe for what I can provide. But I love Sophia. I want to believe that our relationship is based on love and not on anything else. It's just hard to reconcile that with my mother's constant doubts." His words hung in the air, thick with the pain of uncertainty and the longing for his family's unity. Susan could see how deeply this conflict was affecting him. She hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Have you and Sophia talked about this? About your mother's concerns?" she asked gently, trying to encourage him to open up even more. Sometimes a simple conversation can resolve things faster than you'd expect. Thomas gave a small, weary nod. "We've talked about it," he admitted, "but it always seems to end in an argument. Sophia feels judged by my mother, and honestly, I can't blame her. My mom's not exactly subtle with her opinions, but every time we try to address it, it just feels like we're going in circles. I just want peace, for all of us to get along. But sometimes I wonder if I'm asking too much, or if the universe just has other plans." His vulnerability was palpable, and Susan saw a side of him that few others likely ever witnessed, the human side of the man who, to everyone else, seemed so composed and in control. Their conversation flowed naturally, and in that exchange, something shifted between them. It wasn't just about Thomas's struggles anymore, it was about two people sharing their truths, their hopes, and their fears. The bond of trust and mutual respect that had developed over the years deepened in that moment, and Susan felt a profound sense of connection to this man who was, at the end of the day, just trying to navigate the complexities of his own life. "Thomas," She said thoughtfully, "I think your mother only wants what she believes is best for you. She's protective, maybe too much so, but that comes from love. And I believe that, with time, Sophia and your mother will find common ground. They'll see that they both play important roles in your life. And that you need both of them, just in different ways." She paused, offering a reassuring smile. "In the meantime, you're the link between them. With patience and understanding, things can improve. Just don't give up." Thomas looked at her, gratitude softening his features. "Thank you, Susan," he said, his voice warm with appreciation. "You always have a way of making things seem clearer, of helping me see things in a different light. I don't know what I'd do without your perspective. It's like you have this gift for simplifying what feels so complicated." Susan smiled back, touched by his words. "I'm glad I could help," she replied, feeling a sense of fulfillment that went beyond the usual demands of her job. Their conversation had given her insight into Thomas's personal struggles, and in return she felt a renewed sense of purpose in her role, not just as his secretary, but as someone he could confide in and trust. As Thomas stood up, preparing to face another day filled with challenges both at work and at home, Susan felt a quiet strength settle within her. Their conversation had illuminated the person behind the CEO title, showing her that they were both just trying to manage the chaos of their lives the best they could. And now, as she turned back to her work, the thought of asking for a raise didn't seem as daunting as it had before. There was a real human connection between her and Thomas, a mutual respect that went beyond their professional roles. Susan knew that, when the time came, she could approach him with honesty and confidence, knowing that he would listen not just as a boss, but as someone who understood the struggles she faced, just as she now understood his. As the morning unfolded, the office buzzed with the usual energy when Thomas approached Susan with a serious, focused expression. She could sense that something important was on his mind. "Susan," he began, his voice steady but urgent, "I need to let you know that I'll be out for a few days. There's some business I need to attend to in the neighboring city, and I'll be counting on you to keep everything running smoothly while I'm away. It should only be for a day or two. But in case anything comes up, both my mother and Sophia will be in touch with you." His tone conveyed not just instructions but trust and unspoken assurance that he knew Susan could handle whatever came her way in his absence. Though the news caught Susan by surprise, she nodded with a quiet confidence. "Of course, Thomas. You can count on me. I'll make sure everything stays on track here." "Safe travels," she responded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Thomas offered her a grateful smile before heading off, his departure marked by brief but important calls to both Sophia and his mother, Karen. By lunchtime, he was already on the road, leaving Susan to manage the office in his stead. Meanwhile, across town, Karen found herself taking an unexpected detour. After realizing she had left her purse at Thomas and Sophia's house the previous night, she took a taxi back to retrieve it. As the taxi neared the house, something unusual caught Karen's eye. Sophia was stepping into a car that Karen didn't recognize. Her curiosity piqued. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. Acting on instinct, she leaned forward and instructed the taxi driver to follow the unfamiliar vehicle. There was something about the situation that didn't sit right with her, and she was determined to find out what was going on. The taxi trailed the mysterious car through the city streets, winding through traffic until they both arrived at an upscale restaurant. Karen watched as Sophia exited the car, accompanied by a man Karen couldn't identify from her vantage point. A knot of suspicion tightened in her chest. Without hesitation, she paid the driver and slipped out of the taxi, her camera ready in hand, just as always. Finding a discreet hiding spot among the lush greenery near the restaurant, Karen positioned herself, prepared to capture whatever unfolded next. Her heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and dread as she whispered to herself, "Now I'll expose this woman for who she truly is." From her hidden vantage point, Karen's mind raced with possibilities. Who is this man, she wondered? Is this something professional? But Sophia doesn't work, she lives off my son. So what is this about? Karen had never trusted Sophia, convinced that she was with Thomas for all the wrong reasons. She despised Sophia's arrogance, her perceived ulterior motives. But even with her suspicions, what she saw next took her by surprise. Through the zoom of her camera lens, Karen witnessed an encounter that shook her to the core. This wasn't a simple meeting or friendly exchange. There was a palpable intimacy between Sophia and the mysterious man that went far beyond professionalism. They laughed together in a way that felt too familiar, too personal. The hugs they shared lingered longer than what could be brushed off as casual, and the affection between them was undeniable. It wasn't just the way they touched, but the ease with which they did so, as if this connection was something they were used to, something they cherished. Karen's camera clicked in rapid succession, capturing every telling moment with the precision of a seasoned photographer. She documented the scene with an almost clinical detachment, even as her emotions churned beneath the surface. The warmth and closeness she observed between Sophia and the man contrasted sharply with the cold, unfeeling lens through which Karen observed them. Her heart tightened with each new display of affection, each laugh, each touch, each lingering gaze between them. Seated at one of the restaurant's outdoor tables, Sophia and the man seemed completely at ease with each other. Their shoulders brushed together as they sat close, their hands found each other naturally across the table, and their eyes locked in moments of shared understanding. It was as if the world around them didn't exist, as if they were alone in their bubble of connection. Karen couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and sadness at the scene unfolding before her. What does this mean? She wondered, her mind spinning with the implications of the photos she had just taken. Was this the proof she had been seeking? The evidence that would finally reveal Sophia's true nature? Or was it something else? Something more complex than she could understand from the outside looking in? The weight of those questions pressed down on her as she continued to watch, her camera still in hand, unsure of what she would do next. But one thing was certain: these photos, and the truth they might reveal, would change everything. Karen stood on the sidewalk, frozen in thought, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. The photos on her camera held the power to alter everything within their family. She knew that revealing them to Thomas could change the course of his life and his relationship with Sophia forever. Yet, she also understood the complexity of the situation. The tenderness she had witnessed between Sophia and the man told a story, but not the whole story. What were the feelings behind those gestures? What were the circumstances that had led to that moment? Karen was wise enough to know that a picture, though powerful, could never capture the full truth. As Sophia and the man finally parted ways, their smiles bittersweet, Karen slipped out from her hiding spot in the bushes. Her heart was heavy with the knowledge she now carried. She walked back to the sidewalk, clutching her camera as if it held the answers she so desperately sought. Should I tell Thomas, she wondered, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. The decision wasn't just about exposing an affair, it was about understanding the deeper implications of what she had seen, about considering the impact on her son, on her family. One wrong move could destroy everything. With a deep sigh, Karen made a choice. She would hold on to the photos for now, giving herself time to consider the right course of action. She wasn't ready to wield the power she had in her hands, not without more clarity. With a quiet resolve, she slipped the camera into the bag she carried daily, tucking the evidence away for the time being. But just as she began to retreat, Sophia, who had been walking back to her car, caught sight of Karen from across the street. Her heart jolted in her chest, fear and confusion mixing into a sharp, overwhelming panic. The camera bag slung over Karen's shoulder was a clear indication of what had been happening. Sophia's mind raced with the realization that Karen had seen everything. "Karen," Sophia called out, her voice tight with urgency and fear. "What are you doing here?" Karen's body stiffened as she heard her name called. Instinct took over, and without thinking, she turned on her heel and bolted, her feet carrying her away from the confrontation she hadn't been prepared for. "It's none of your business," she shouted back, her voice frantic as her heart pounded in her chest. All she knew was that she had to get away, to escape the inevitable confrontation that would follow if she stayed. Sophia, stunned and alarmed by Karen's sudden flight, watched as she ran wildly, her movements erratic and desperate. The older woman's form disappeared into the distance, heading in the direction of the nearby forest. Panic surged through Sophia as she realized the gravity of the situation. Karen had seen everything and worse. She had evidence. What had started as a private moment now threatened to unravel everything. Sophia stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing with fear and guilt. What should she do now? Chase after Karen? Try to explain herself? Or was it too late for that? The reality of her actions, and the consequences they could bring, loomed large in her mind, and for the first time she felt truly powerless. Meanwhile, Karen continued running, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fled toward the forest. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that she needed to get away, to put distance between herself and Sophia, to figure out what to do next. The forest loomed ahead, its dark, twisted branches offering a kind of refuge, and without thinking, she plunged into the trees, the dense foliage swallowing her whole. She ran until her legs burned and her lungs screamed for air, finally slowing to a stop deep within the woods. The quiet of the forest wrapped around her, offering a momentary sense of calm. But even as she tried to catch her breath, the weight of the photos in her bag seemed heavier than ever. Karen sank to the ground, leaning against the rough bark of a tree, her mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. What had she just witnessed? What should she do now? And most importantly, how would she protect her son from the truth she had uncovered? Sophia stood at the edge of the street, her breath caught in her throat as she watched Karen disappear further and further away. The speeding car that had separated them felt like a cruel twist of fate, a physical manifestation of the widening gap between her and the truth she had been trying to keep hidden. "Wait, Karen." She called out again, her voice desperate, but it was too late. Karen was gone, her form swallowed by the distance and the forest beyond. "We need to talk. You can't show those photos to Thomas." Sophia's voice echoed uselessly across the street, frustration and panic tightening in her chest. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her mind racing as the reality of the situation sank in. She saw everything. And she probably took pictures, Sophia thought, her heart pounding with dread. What had started as a seemingly innocent lunch had spiraled into a nightmare, and now the consequences of her actions loomed large. Why did I choose that restaurant? Of all the places, why there, where anyone could have seen us? Regret gnawed at her, but it was too late for second-guessing. The sight of Karen vanishing into the forest only deepened her fear. The trees, once just a part of the landscape, now seemed to represent something much darker, a place where her secrets had taken root, where they could grow uncontrollably if not carefully managed. "Thomas will find out," Sophia whispered to herself, the weight of those words pressing down on her. "And when he does, he'll leave me." The thought of losing him, of watching their life together crumble because of her own choices, filled her with a cold dread. But Sophia wasn't one to give up easily. Even in the face of disaster, she felt a surge of determination. She couldn't let Karen reveal those photos, not without trying to stop her first. "I need to find her. I need to get those photos before it's too late," she resolved, knowing that time was slipping through her fingers like sand. But even as she made this decision, she understood how difficult it would be. Karen wasn't just any woman. She was shrewd, protective, and deeply invested in Thomas's well-being. If she believed Sophia was a threat to her son, she wouldn't hesitate to expose her. With her heart pounding, Sophia knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't allow Karen to control the narrative. But where would she even start? The forest was vast, and Karen had a head start. Every step Sophia had taken to hide the truth now seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. and the consequences of her actions were no longer just a distant possibility. They were here, pressing in on her from every side. Meanwhile, across town at the company, Susan was wrapping up her day. With Thomas out of town, she took the opportunity to leave a little earlier than usual. After a quick check-in at his office to ensure everything was in order, she grabbed her things and stepped out into the warm afternoon air, feeling a rare sense of freedom. For once, the weight of responsibility seemed a little lighter on her shoulders. She climbed into her car, her mind turning to her son, David, and the unexpected gift of extra time she had been given. Today I can at least take my son out to enjoy the day, she thought with a small smile as she drove toward David's daycare. The idea of spending a few extra hours with him filled her with happiness. Life had been so busy, so full of challenges, but this was a moment to savor a chance to make memories with her son, to let go of the worries that usually consumed her. As she pulled up to the daycare and saw David's bright smile as he ran toward her, Susan felt a sense of peace. Whatever the future held, whether it was the conversation she needed to have with Thomas or the challenges of balancing work and motherhood, at least for today, she had this moment of calm. Little did she know that while her world felt steady, Sophia's was teetering on the edge of chaos. Susan took David to the familiar playground nestled next to the edge of the forest, a quiet sanctuary where he could run, climb, and let his boundless energy spill into the open air. As David played on the swings and slides, Susan settled on a nearby bench, taking a moment to catch her breath and reflect. Her thoughts wandered over the events of the past few days, the decisions she had made, and the conversation she planned to have with Thomas when he returned. The evening was peaceful, a welcome respite from the usual rush of life. But that peace was suddenly shattered by a distant cry for help, a sound that pierced the tranquility of the evening like a sharp blade. The voice, faint but desperate, echoed from deep within the forest. Susan's heart leapt in her chest as she stood abruptly, adrenaline surging through her veins. Someone was in trouble. She turned toward David, her voice calm but firm, despite the fear coursing through her. "David, stay here and don't leave the playground." "I'll be right back," she instructed, her eyes meeting his to ensure he understood the seriousness of her words. With a quick glance to make sure David was safe, Susan ran toward the forest, her feet pounding against the ground as she followed the sound of the cries. Branches snapped beneath her hurried steps, and dry leaves crunched underfoot as she plunged deeper into the woods, the dense trees closing in around her. The calls for help grew louder, more distinct, guiding her through the winding paths of the forest until finally she reached the source of the distress. There, in a small clearing, she found an older woman lying on the ground, struggling to rise. Susan's breath caught in her throat as recognition set in. The woman was Karen, Thomas's mother. Though they had never met outside of the few company events Susan had attended, Karen's face was unmistakable, even in the dim light of the forest. She looked disheveled and shaken, her gray hair tousled, and her ankle twisted at an odd angle. "Are you okay?" "What happened?" Susan asked, her voice full of concern as she knelt beside Karen. Extending her hand, she added, "Stay calm, Ma am. I'm here to help you." Compassion and determination were etched into Susan's expression as she reached out, offering Karen the support she needed. Karen, visibly relieved to see someone, grasped Susan's hand with trembling fingers. "I got lost," she explained, her voice shaky from the ordeal. "I was trying to find my way back, but twisted my ankle and fell." Her words were tinged with both fear and exhaustion, the strength in her resolve fading after what must have been a long struggle. Susan quickly examined Karen's ankle, noticing the swelling and the way she winced with every slight movement. "We need to get you out of here," Susan said gently but firmly. "Can you walk if I support you? It's not safe to stay here, and my son is waiting outside the forest." Her voice carried a quiet authority, a calm assurance that Karen could trust her. Karen nodded, grateful for the help, and leaned on Susan as they slowly began to make their way back through the forest. Each step was careful, deliberate, with Susan bearing much of Karen's weight to keep her steady. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows between the trees, and Susan knew they needed to move quickly before darkness overtook them. As they neared the edge of the forest, the relief of emerging from the dense woods was palpable. The open sky greeted them, and Susan could see David still playing at the playground, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding nearby. Susan's mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. The odds of finding Karen here, in this remote part of the forest, seemed too strange to be mere coincidence. What had brought Karen here in the first place? Once they reached the safety of the park, Susan helped Karen sit down on a bench near the playground. She looked at the older woman, her mind filled with questions. There was so much she needed to understand, not just about the situation that had brought Karen into the forest, but also about the deeper story that seemed to lie beneath the surface. But for now, Susan focused on the immediate task at hand. "I'll call for help," she said, reaching for her phone. "We need to get you proper medical attention for your ankle." As Susan dialed, she couldn't help but feel that this encounter with Karen was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that might tie together the threads of the lives she and Thomas had been quietly living in parallel. The forest, with its shadows and secrets, seemed to have brought their worlds together in an unexpected way, and Susan knew that from this moment on, nothing would quite be the same. Leaning heavily on Susan for support, Karen began to share her story as they slowly made their way out of the dense forest. Her voice was low and filled with urgency, each word carefully chosen as if she was afraid of being overheard. "I'm being followed," Karen confessed, her breath coming in uneven gasps. "I saw things I never should have seen, things that involve people close to me. My son. He's caught up in it too." Karen's eyes darted around nervously, making sure their conversation remained private. She was deliberately vague, avoiding names, because she didn't know who Susan was or if she could truly trust her. And just as Karen remained a mystery to Susan, the reverse was also true. As they continued walking, Karen fumbled with a bag she had brought along, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out an old camera. She turned to Susan with a serious expression, her eyes reflecting the weight of the situation. "I need you to do something incredibly important for me," Karen said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. She held out the camera to Susan, her hands almost reluctant to let go. "Whatever happens, don't let anyone else get their hands on this. Take it to a man named Thomas Anderson. He'll know what to do with it." Her instructions were clear, yet they left Susan confused and filled with dread. The mention of Thomas made Susan's heart skip a beat, but Karen, unaware of their connection, continued without hesitation. Before Susan could even begin to process what was happening or ask questions, Karen glanced over her shoulder, a sense of urgency overtaking her once more. "I have to go," she said quickly, her voice a mix of fear and determination. "I need to shake off Sophia," and with that cryptic statement, Karen turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the trees, leaving Susan standing alone at the edge of the forest. The camera, now in Susan's possession, felt like a ticking time bomb, an object holding secrets that had yet to be revealed. Susan stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, her mind racing to catch up with everything that had just happened. Slowly, with trembling hands, she opened the camera's gallery. What she saw shocked her to her core. The images on the screen were undeniable photos of her boss's wife, Sophia, locked in a series of intimate embraces with an unknown man. The images were raw, personal, and deeply incriminating. Each photo felt like a punch to the gut, not only because they exposed a betrayal Susan never imagined, but because she now held the evidence of that betrayal in her hands. A flood of emotions washed over her: fear, confusion, anger. She had never expected to be thrust into such a situation, let alone one so tangled with the personal lives of people she knew. The images were more than just evidence, they were a violation of privacy, a secret that should never have been captured, much less revealed to Thomas. The mention of Sophia by Karen only deepened the complexity of the situation, adding a layer of danger that made Susan's heart pound even harder in her chest. What am I supposed to do? Susan thought, her mind swirling with indecision. The camera in her hands felt impossibly heavy, as though it carried the weight of the entire world. The photos were powerful, too powerful. They had the potential to ruin lives, to unravel everything that Thomas had worked so hard to build. But was it her place to deliver that devastating blow? Should she keep the photos hidden to protect herself and avoid becoming entangled in the fallout? Or should she fulfill Karen's request and give the camera to Thomas, exposing the betrayal and witnessing his reaction firsthand? Susan was paralyzed by the moral dilemma she now faced. On one hand, she wanted to protect herself from the chaos that would undoubtedly follow if these photos came to light. But on the other hand, how could she, in good conscience, withhold something so significant from Thomas? The man she had come to respect deserved the truth, but that truth could also destroy him. The weight of that decision pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Barely able to process what had just happened, Susan hurried back to the playground to collect David. Her heart raced as she spotted him, his innocent smile a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. She quickly grabbed his hand, trying to hide the camera bag as best as she could, though to her it felt like 1,000 eyes were watching her every move. The small object now seemed to weigh a ton in her conscience, every step toward home burdened by the knowledge of what she carried and the decision she had yet to make. As they left the park, Susan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, knowing that whatever choice she made would have far-reaching consequences, not just for her but for everyone involved. And as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, she knew that the moment of truth was fast approaching, whether she was ready for it or not. From a distance, Sophia's sharp eyes caught sight of Susan. Her gaze instantly locked onto the bag slung over Susan's shoulder, the same bag Karen had been carrying. A wave of dread washed over Sophia as she recognized the implications of what that bag might contain. With fierce determination etched on her face, Sophia broke into a run, her heart pounding as she closed the distance between them. She had to reach Susan before it was too late. Susan, feeling the tension mounting with every passing second, quickened her pace. Her heart raced as she clutched David in one arm, the weight of the bag pressing into her other. She could hear Sophia's footsteps behind her, growing louder, more urgent. Panic surged through Susan as she reached her car, practically throwing herself inside. In her haste, she placed David in the back seat with more speed than care, her hands trembling. "Sorry, sweetheart, just a moment," she whispered, trying to maintain some semblance of calm for both of them. But David, sensing the tension in the air, began to cry, his confused sobs filling the small space of the car. Susan's hands fumbled as she started the engine, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror, where she saw Sophia just steps away. Without hesitation, Susan hit the gas, speeding out of the parking lot like she was fleeing from a predator. The sound of the tires screeching against the pavement echoed in her ears as she left Sophia behind, though the panic in her heart remained. Sophia's figure grew smaller in the mirror, but Susan knew she wasn't safe yet. She couldn't let Sophia get her hands on the photos. Those images were the only proof of the affair, and if Sophia got hold of them, she would undoubtedly destroy the evidence. But even as Susan drove away, her mind was a whirlwind of questions. What am I going to do now, she wondered, trying to think clearly despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins and the sound of David's crying echoing in her ears. As she navigated through the familiar streets on the way home, Susan's mind spun with options. The truth about Sophia's extramarital relationship was now immortalized in the photos Karen had taken. They could ruin not only Sophia's life but Thomas's as well. I need to talk to Thomas and show him these photos, she thought, the realization dawning on her that this might be the only way forward, no matter how difficult it would be. It felt like the rational decision, but fear still clung to her, making it hard to breathe. David's cries grew louder, his little voice filled with confusion and distress. "Calm down, David. Mommy's here," Susan said, her voice trembling as she reached back to offer him comfort, though her eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. The weight of what she now carried was overwhelming, a secret that could shatter lives. Her thoughts swirled, and she pieced together what little she knew. That woman. She must be Karen, Thomas's mother, Susan realized with a shock. It all made sense now. Karen had been the one trailing Sophia, taking photos, determined to expose the truth. She's been right all along, Susan thought bitterly. Karen always said Sophia didn't deserve Thomas, that she was only with him for the money. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Susan's determination solidified. She had to do the right thing. When Susan finally pulled into the driveway of her home, relief washed over her, though her heart still pounded in her chest. She hurriedly gathered David and the bag with the camera, rushing inside as if the safety of her home could somehow protect her from the chaos that awaited. Once inside, she placed David on the couch and held him close for a moment, his innocent presence grounding her in the midst of the turmoil. "It's going to be okay," she whispered to him and to herself, though the certainty of those words felt distant and elusive. After settling David into bed, Susan retreated to the kitchen, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. She sat at the table, her mind racing as she stared at the bag containing the camera. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside her, its warmth fading as quickly as her sense of calm. "I have to show these photos to Thomas," she murmured to herself, the weight of that decision pressing down on her. But with Thomas away for the next 2 days, the urgency of the situation gnawed at her, leaving her with no clear path forward. Just as she began to devise a plan, her phone rang, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. Susan's heart skipped a beat as she glanced at the screen. An unknown number flashed across it, but something in her gut told her to answer. She pressed the phone to her ear, bracing herself for what she might hear. Susan came, Sophia's voice on the other end, sharp and filled with tension. Susan's heart sank at the sound. "Give me that camera," Sophia demanded, her tone cold and threatening. "This situation has nothing to do with you. Hand it over, or I'll make sure you regret it." The veiled threat hung in the air, thick with malice. Susan's grip tightened around the phone, her pulse quickening. She had expected something like this, but the reality of hearing Sophia's voice, filled with anger and desperation, sent a chill down her spine. She realized, with a jolt of fear, that she was now caught in a dangerous game, one that could cost her everything. Susan's fear spiked sharply as she tried to maintain her composure. Every instinct told her to crumble under the weight of Sophia's threats, but she knew she couldn't let that happen. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. "How did you get my number?" "I don't remember ever giving it to you or talking to you before," she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady even though panic was beginning to take hold. Her mind raced, trying to figure out how Sophia had found her so quickly. "And another thing," she added, her words laced with defiance, "I'm not giving you anything. You betrayed Thomas. He trusted me, and I'm not going to make the same careless mistake you did." Sophia's laughter was sharp and filled with disdain. "Thomas left his phone at home, Susan. And guess what? Your number was right there, highlighted with your profile picture and everything. I recognized you immediately, the same woman I saw with Karen's camera at the park. Very interesting, isn't it?" She replied, her voice dripping with confidence, each word a deliberate stab at Susan's growing fear. Susan's heart raced, the fear inside her swelling into a silent storm that threatened to engulf her completely. Her thoughts spun in all directions, struggling to find an escape from this nightmare. She didn't know how to respond. In a desperate act, she hung up the phone, cutting off Sophia's smug voice mid-sentence, hoping that by ending the call, she could somehow regain control of the situation. But the panic only intensified. In a moment of desperation, Susan dialed Thomas's number, needing to hear his voice, needing some reassurance that there was a way to resolve all of this. The phone rang once, twice, and then Sophia answered again. "Look at you." Trying to reach Thomas, Sophia taunted, her voice brimming with satisfaction. "I told you I wasn't lying." She paused for effect, her next words cold and calculated. "Let me be perfectly clear. Susan, if you don't return that camera, I will find you wherever you are. And that includes going after your son." The phone slipped from Susan's trembling hands, hitting the table with a dull thud. The world seemed to collapse around her as Sophia's threat reverberated in her mind. The idea that Sophia could somehow harm David was more than she could bear. A terror, unlike anything she had ever known, gripped her heart. But amid that terror, something else began to rise: determination. "I need to protect David," Susan thought, the resolution slowly hardening within her. The idea of Sophia carrying out her threat sent a surge of adrenaline through her system. She stood up, her mind racing to figure out her next move. She knew now that there was no easy way out of this situation, no way to resolve it without confronting the reality of what was happening. But she also knew that she couldn't let fear paralyze her, not when David's safety was at stake. Her thoughts turned to the immediate steps she needed to take. First, she had to ensure David was safe, away from the reach of anyone who might try to hurt him. Then, and only then, could she think about how to handle Sophia and the consequences of the choices she had made. Susan's mind shifted into overdrive as she began to devise a plan. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Every decision from here on out had to be calculated, deliberate. Her first priority was David, his safety above all else. She would find a way to keep him out of harm's reach. After that, she would face Sophia, armed with the truth and whatever strength she could muster. With a deep breath, Susan forced herself to think clearly. The camera, the photos, the secrets, these were no longer just someone else's problem. They were hers now, and how she handled them would determine everything. As dawn began to break, Susan knew her decision had to be firm. Protecting David was her top priority, no matter the cost. But deep down, she also felt an obligation to warn Thomas about Sophia, who had crossed a dangerous line with her threats. The camera, hidden away in her bag, was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a catalyst that could set everything in motion. But the real battle wasn't just about a few photographs. It was about keeping her son safe and unraveling a web of deceit that had suddenly entangled her. Susan sat in the quiet of the early morning, holding her cup of coffee between her trembling hands. Her eyes stared blankly ahead, her mind racing with worry and uncertainty. David sat at the table beside her, innocently playing with his toy cars, completely unaware of the danger that now loomed over them. The sight of him, so blissfully unaware, only deepened the knot in her stomach. How am I going to find Thomas without knowing where he is in that other city? And what if Sophia finds me first? The thoughts gnawed at her, each one more terrifying than the last. The camera in her bag felt like a ticking time bomb. One wrong move and her peaceful life, her son's safety, could be shattered in an instant. The sudden vibration of her phone on the table shattered the silence of the cafe. Susan hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She already knew who it was before she answered, dread settling deep in her bones. Slowly, she picked up the phone and pressed it to her ear. "You're testing my patience," Sophia's voice came through, cold and unyielding. The calm menace in her tone made Susan's blood run cold. "If I don't have that camera in my hands by the end of the day, you will regret it." Susan swallowed hard, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "Sophia, this won't end well for either of us. Why can't we just talk about this? There's a child involved." She pleaded, her eyes darting to David, who remained blissfully unaware, lost in the world of his toy cars. The thought of him being in danger because of her sent a wave of nausea through her. Talk. Sophia's laugh was sharp and mocking, filled with disdain. The time for talking passed when you decided to stick your nose where it didn't belong, you busybody. Thomas can't know and he won't. As for you, if you don't hand over that camera soon, well, I hope you're prepared to deal with the consequences. The veiled threat echoed in Susan's mind, sending waves of panic crashing over her. Sophia's words were like a tightening noose around her neck. Would she really go after David? The very thought made Susan's heart race, desperation creeping into every corner of her mind. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let that happen. Susan hung up the phone, her hands trembling. She had to think fast. There was no more time to hesitate. The realization hit her hard. She needed to find Thomas before Sophia could track her down. He needed to hear the truth from her, not through a series of damning photos. But where could she start? How could she reach him when all she had was a name and a vague idea of where he might be? With her mind racing, Susan knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't afford to let fear paralyze her. Taking a deep breath, she stood up and gathered David's toys, her heart pounding with the weight of the decision she was about to make. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: she had to protect her son at all costs. Everything else could wait. With David by her side and the camera hidden safely in her bag, Susan headed toward her car, a plan slowly beginning to take shape in her mind. She would find Thomas. She would tell him everything. And she would make sure that whatever happened next, she and David would come out of this safe and together. Across the city, Sophia returned to Thomas's house with an unsettling sense of purpose. As she walked inside, she found Karen there, an unexpected but potentially useful encounter. With a deliberate movement, Sophia locked the door behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing ominously in the quiet room. She turned to Karen, her expression cold and calculating, making her intentions clear without needing to say a word. "We're staying here until Susan hands over the camera," Sophia declared, her voice steady and menacing. It wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum, and the underlying threat in her tone was impossible to miss. Karen's eyes widened in shock, but she tried to keep calm, refusing to let fear control her. "You can't keep me here against my will," Sophia, Karen said, her voice firm, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "This is madness. You've crossed a line, a criminal line, and you should be ashamed of yourself for this and for everything else you've done." Sophia, unfazed by Karen's words, began to pace back and forth in the living room, her movements slow and deliberate as she revealed her twisted plans. Her voice was eerily calm as she laid out every detail, making it clear that she had thought this through. "No one is going to stop me, Karen. Not you, and certainly not Susan. Once I get that camera back, everything will be resolved, and I'll make sure no one can stand in my way." As Karen listened to Sophia's malicious intentions, a wave of anger and desperation washed over her. How had things come to this? How could Sophia be so heartless, so selfish? How can you live with yourself? Karen demanded, her voice shaking with indignation. "You've taken advantage of my son, using him for his money while betraying him with another man. You don't love him, you never did. All you care about is yourself." The tension in the room thickened as their argument escalated. Accusations flew from both sides, each word sharper than the last. Sophia's cold gaze never wavered, and there was no sign of remorse in her eyes. She was utterly confident in her ability to manipulate the situation to her advantage. "I do whatever it takes to protect what's mine," she retorted, her voice as cutting as a blade. "And right now that means keeping you here until I get what I want." Karen's mind raced as she tried to find a way out. She couldn't let Sophia succeed. Thomas needed to know the truth, and Susan needed to be warned. But for now, she had to play it smart. She had to buy time. Feigning a begrudging agreement, Karen nodded slightly, as if considering Sophia's point of view. "I understand," she said, her voice carefully measured. "You're just trying to protect yourself. But maybe there's another way we can resolve this without anyone getting hurt." Even as she spoke, Karen's thoughts were elsewhere. She needed to find a way to get word to Susan, to warn her before it was too late. "I will find a way out," she promised herself, though the uncertainty of her situation gnawed at her confidence. The fight for truth and justice had turned into a race against time, and Karen knew that every second counted. Sophia's lies were like a ticking bomb, ready to cause irreparable damage if not diffused in time. In the heat of the argument, Sophia, perhaps fueled by adrenaline or the thrill of her perceived control, began to boast. Her smug smile twisted her features as she gloated over her manipulations. "Do you think this is all I've done?" She sneered, her voice dripping with arrogance. "Embezzling money from the company was just the start. This other man came into my life recently, and I found him. Interesting. We started going out. Thomas is so naive, thinking he has everything under control while I orchestrate every move behind the scenes." Karen's stomach churned as she listened to Sophia's brazen confession. Every word confirmed her worst fears about the woman who had wormed her way into Thomas's life. This wasn't just about infidelity or greed, it was about a deep betrayal, one that went beyond just a marriage. Sophia's manipulation extended into every aspect of their lives, and Karen knew that if she didn't act soon, everything would fall apart. But for now, Karen had to keep her cool. She had to gather as much information as possible, all while pretending to go along with Sophia's twisted logic. Inside, though, she was burning with resolve. No matter what it took, she would make sure that Thomas and Susan knew the truth before Sophia could do any more damage. Karen could barely wrap her mind around what she was hearing. Sophia's audacious confessions, dripping with arrogance, sent chills down her spine. How could someone be so brazen, so unapologetic in their deception? "How can you be so?" So Karen's voice faltered, struggling to find words for the contempt and disbelief she felt. Each revelation added another layer to the tangled web of lies Sophia had woven. "Clever?" Calculating, Sophia interjected with a smirk, her voice laced with self-satisfaction. "I do what's necessary to survive in this world, Karen. If that means taking more than what's given to me, then so be it. Thomas will never find out. He trusts me far too much for that." Sophia's casual admission of her crimes left Karen horrified, but also more determined than ever to stop her. The audacity of Sophia's actions fueled a fire within Karen that she hadn't felt in years. "This won't stay like this," Karen murmured under her breath, her resolve hardening. "I will find a way to tell Thomas. He needs to know who he's really married to." Sophia's laughter rang out, cold and mocking, filling the room with a sinister echo. "Good luck with that," she sneered. "Do you really think anyone will believe you? An old woman with a camera, trying to stir up trouble, versus Thomas's devoted wife. Please, Karen, be realistic. By the time you even think of telling him, that camera will be in pieces, and so will your so-called evidence." But despite Sophia's threats and the cold confidence in her voice, Karen felt a surge of courage. Every word Sophia uttered, every twisted boast, only solidified Karen's determination. "No matter what you say, Sophia, the truth always comes out, and I will make sure Thomas knows everything," Karen vowed, her voice steady with conviction. Sophia, in her arrogance, didn't realize that her words were only strengthening Karen's resolve. She had underestimated the quiet, determined strength of someone who had nothing left to lose but her integrity. And as Sophia plotted her next move, Karen's mind raced with ideas, with possibilities, with hope that justice could still be served. Meanwhile, night had fallen, and Susan sat in her quiet home, her mind swirling with the weight of her decisions. She was exhausted, yet sleep seemed impossible with so much at stake. The silence in the room felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. That's when her phone vibrated, the sudden noise shattering the quiet. Susan glanced at the screen, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the unknown number flashing on it. She hesitated for a moment, dread washing over her, but then she answered, her voice coming out firmer than she felt. "Hello?" On the other end, Sophia's voice was icy and calculated, sending a shiver down Susan's spine. "I have Karen trapped here," Sophia said without preamble, her words hitting Susan like a punch to the gut. "She can't leave, even if she wants to, and believe me, she really wants to leave." There was a pause before Sophia delivered her ultimatum. "She'll only be released when I get what I want, the camera." Susan's heart raced, guilt and fear coursing through her. She could barely breathe as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. But she fought to keep her voice steady, forcing herself to stay calm for Karen's sake. "What are you doing to her, Sophia? Don't harm her. Remember, this is a crime," Susan pleaded, trying to appeal to any shred of humanity Sophia might still have. But she knew, deep down, that Sophia wouldn't be swayed by reason or morality. Sophia's voice remained chillingly calm. "The only crime here, Susan, is you interfering in something that doesn't concern you. Karen stays where she is until I have that camera. It's as simple as that." Susan's mind raced. She knew she was running out of time. Sophia had Karen, and who knew what she was capable of doing next? But Susan couldn't give in. She had to find a way to protect Karen and bring the truth to light, even if it meant risking everything. Sophia's laughter echoed through the phone, sending a shiver down Susan's spine. "She's fine for now, but if you don't follow my instructions, I can't promise it will stay that way. We're at Thomas's house. Come alone, and don't even think about calling the police, or the consequences will be unpleasant," Sophia said, her voice dripping with malice. As the line went dead, Susan stood frozen, trapped in a nightmare that seemed to grow darker by the minute. Fear for Karen's safety mixed with a rising tide of anger towards Sophia. She knew she had to act fast, and an idea, desperate but possible, flashed through her mind. Without wasting another second, Susan connected the camera to her phone, using technology to transfer all the photos directly to her device. The images flowed onto the screen, each one a damning piece of evidence against Sophia, a silent witness to the betrayal and deceit. With the photos now safely stored on her phone, Susan grabbed the camera and headed to Thomas's house, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no turning back now. As she drove, she made a quick call to the police, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her. "Hello, police. There's a woman being held hostage at Viller Street, mansion number 4. The person holding her is dangerous. Please hurry." When she arrived at the mansion, she saw Sophia waiting for her, an unsettling, triumphant smile on her face. "Hand over the camera," Sophia demanded, her voice laced with eagerness, unable to conceal her anxiety. Susan, determined to stay calm, did as Sophia asked. She handed the camera over, watching as Sophia immediately smashed it, the sound of the plastic shattering filling the air. Sophia's expression was one of pure satisfaction, as if she had just erased all traces of her guilt. Karen was finally released, stumbling towards Susan with a mix of confusion and relief. They exchanged a look, filled with unspoken understanding, while Sophia reveled in her supposed victory. "You see now," Sophia taunted, "you can't stop me. Thomas loves me, and he will continue to love me. That's how it should be." But just as Sophia finished gloating, the front door creaked open, and Thomas walked in, returning from his trip earlier than expected. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the sight of his mother, his secretary, and his wife, all gathered in the living room. The tension in the air was palpable, and a deep sense of dread settled in his gut. Something was wrong. Sophia greeted him with a casual smile, attempting to act as if nothing was out of place, but the unease in the room was impossible to ignore. Susan, summoning every ounce of courage she had left, stepped forward and broke the silence. "Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside her, "I need to show you something." She took out her phone, opened the photo gallery, and handed it to him. The images spoke louder than any words could, each one revealing the painful truth that Sophia had so desperately tried to hide. As Thomas stared at the photos, a heavy silence fell over the room. His face went from confusion to shock as he scrolled through the damning evidence of his wife's betrayal. He couldn't look away, each image piercing him deeper than the last. Sophia, seeing the shift in his expression, tried to speak, to explain, but Karen's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "My son," Karen said firmly, her voice filled with the weight of truth. This woman admitted to more than just betrayal. She's been deceiving you for a long time, embezzling money from the company, lying to you, having affairs behind your back. She's been using you, Thomas, manipulating you while pretending to be the devoted wife. Thomas stood there, the world he knew crumbling around him. He looked from Karen to Susan, then finally to Sophia, who had gone pale, her arrogance shattered. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. Sophia, seeing her carefully constructed facade fall apart, made one last desperate attempt. "Thomas, please," she begged, her voice trembling with fear. "It's not what it looks like. I can explain." But Thomas cut her off, his voice cold and filled with hurt. "I've seen enough, Sophia. You've lied to me, used me, and destroyed everything we had." There's nothing left to explain. His words hung in the air, final and unforgiving. Sophia's face crumbled, her confidence evaporating as she realized that the life she had manipulated and controlled was slipping through her fingers. The police arrived moments later, their presence signaling the end of her reign of deceit. Sophia was taken away, her attempts to plead and protest falling on deaf ears. As the door closed behind her, Thomas stood in the wreckage of his life, surrounded by the people who had tried to protect him. He looked at Susan and Karen, his face filled with gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." But Susan shook her head gently. "You don't need to, Thomas. Just take care of yourself and rebuild from here." Karen stepped forward, placing a hand on her son's shoulder. "We'll get through this together," she said softly, her voice filled with the love and support that had always been there, even in the darkest of times. And as the night stretched on, the three of them stood together, united by the truth and the hope of healing the wounds that had been inflicted by lies. As Sophia stood frozen in the doorway, her only thought had been to flee from the consequences of her actions. But when she opened the door, she was met with the sight of police officers waiting on the front steps, their presence striking fear into her heart. The cold realization that there was no escape drained the remaining color from her face. Susan, watching the scene unfold, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction as she saw the look of defeat on Sophia's face. "Did you really think you could get away with it?" Sophia, Susan called out, her voice carrying the sweet taste of justice. "I already called the police. It's over." Thomas, standing nearby, still reeling from the shock of the revelations, looked at Sophia with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. He couldn't fathom how he had been so blind, how he had allowed himself to be deceived so completely. His voice was firm, but there was an undercurrent of pain as he spoke. "I can't do this anymore. I can't bear that I was deceived so blatantly, especially after my mother warned me so many times. We're ending this, Sophia, right now." His words were final, a symbolic closure to the betrayal and lies that had defined their relationship. There was no going back. The truth had been revealed, and there was no place for Sophia in his life anymore. As the police moved forward to take Sophia into custody, she offered no resistance. The fight had drained out of her, and all that was left was the hollow realization that her carefully constructed facade had crumbled. She was led away in handcuffs, her head hanging low, while the others remained in the house, watching her departure in silence. The room fell quiet once Sophia was gone. Thomas, Susan, and Karen stood together, bound by the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them to this moment. The weight of what had just transpired hung in the air, but there was also a sense of closure of an old chapter ending and a new one beginning, marked by truth and the promise of rebuilding. Feeling overwhelmed, Thomas asked for some time alone to process everything. Karen and Susan understood, and they each returned to their homes that night, giving him the space he needed to come to terms with the painful reality of his failed marriage. The next day, despite the lingering effects of recent events, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere at Thomas's company. The air felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. When Susan arrived at work, she was called into Thomas's office. His expression was a mix of relief and gratitude as he greeted her. "Susan," Thomas began, his voice filled with sincerity, "I don't know how to properly thank you for everything you've done. Not only did you take care of the company in my absence, but you also saved my mother. I owe you more than words can express. That's why I've decided to give you a raise and a bonus. It's the least I can do." Susan's heart swelled with emotion as she listened to Thomas's words. The gratitude in his tone, the recognition of her efforts, meant more to her than she could express. Overcome with emotion, she responded softly, "Thomas, I don't know what to say. Thank you." Without thinking, she stood up and hugged him, a spontaneous gesture of appreciation and relief. Thomas, equally moved by the moment, returned the hug, a genuine smile lighting up his face for the first time in days. It was a brief but heartfelt exchange, a moment of shared gratitude and understanding between two people who had been through so much. As Susan left Thomas's office, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She walked back to her desk with a renewed sense of purpose and value, knowing that the difficult days were behind her. The storm had passed, and now a new phase was beginning, not just for her, but for Thomas as well. "Now I can easily pay for daycare and give a better life to my son," Susan thought, her heart brimming with hope. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly optimistic about the future, grateful for the second chance that had come out of the chaos and ready to embrace the opportunities that lay ahead. Sophia, now imprisoned, was forced to confront the consequences of her actions. But instead of accepting responsibility, she clung to her resentment and bitterness like armor against the reality of her downfall. Her mind seethed with anger and thoughts of revenge. "They'll see. They'll all pay," she whispered to herself, her heart hardened by the refusal to acknowledge her own mistakes. Even in defeat, Sophia remained determined to hold on to her darkness, solidifying her lonely fate behind bars. Her refusal to change ensured that she would remain trapped, not just physically, but emotionally, in a life of bitterness and isolation. Karen, however, found peace in the resolution of the events that had unfolded. Standing on the other side of the storm, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in a long time. The truth always finds a way, she thought, reflecting on everything that had transpired. She was satisfied to have played her part in bringing the lies to light and protecting her family. With Sophia's deceit exposed and dealt with, Karen looked forward to the peaceful days ahead, confident that her son could now rebuild his life without the shadows of betrayal looming over him. Thomas, free from the toxic web of deception that Sophia had woven around him, felt a renewed sense of purpose. Susan and Karen's honesty and courage had given him the strength to face the painful truth, and now he was determined to rebuild. It's time to move forward, he thought, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. With a fresh perspective, Thomas was committed to turning the adversities he had faced into the foundation of a better future, both personally and professionally. The challenges had left scars, but they had also opened his eyes to the value of loyalty, trust, and integrity. And so each character moved forward, shaped by the trials they had endured. Susan, now more valued and secure in her job, embraced the future with optimism. She knew that the hardest days were behind her, and she was ready to make the most of the new opportunities that lay ahead. Her life, once filled with uncertainty and fear, was now steady and filled with promise. Thomas, deeply grateful for the strength and loyalty of the women in his life, dedicated himself to repairing the damage left by Sophia's betrayal. He was determined to create a new environment in his life and at work, one built on trust, respect, and honesty. The events had changed him, but for the better. He would no longer allow himself to be deceived or manipulated, and he was ready to lead with clarity and compassion. Sophia, in contrast, remained a grim reminder of what happens when someone refuses to face the truth. Isolated by her own choices, she lingered in the shadows of her bitterness, a cautionary tale that, in the end, the truth always prevails, no matter how tightly one clings to the lies. What have you learned from this story? Reflect on how the power of truth, loyalty, and integrity can shape the course of our lives. We'd love to hear from you. Comment below with one thing you've learned and how you plan to apply it in your life. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring stories like this one.